All right, so today we're diving into Deuteronomy chapter 2.
Buckle up.
Yeah, this is a really interesting part of the Israelites' journey
Oh, yeah.
to the Promised Land. And there's so much in here that we can still relate to today.
Yeah.
Like avoiding conflict, trusting in divine timing,
Right.
recognizing blessings where we might not expect them.
Yeah, it's really about the journey, not just the destination.
Exactly. So let's set the scene.
Okay.
The Israelites have been wandering in the wilderness for, well, a while now.
40 years to be exact.
40 years, and they're finally getting close to the Promised Land.
Right. But they're told to bypass certain territories, specifically those belonging to the descendants of Esau and the Moabites.
It's like God saying, hey, this is their land. Don't mess with them.
Stay in your lane.
Stay in your lane. Even though they had this huge mission, this promise of a land flowing with milk and honey, they couldn't just grab whatever they wanted.
Oh, right. And I think that's a really important point. Even today, it's about respecting boundaries. Personal space, professional boundaries, international relations.
Yeah, imagine if everyone just took what they wanted when they wanted it. It would be total chaos.
Exactly. We all have our goals, but bumping up against each other isn't always the best way forward.
Right. Okay, but here's where it gets interesting. They're actually told to buy food and water from these groups they're supposed to avoid. It's like,
Yeah.
hey, we get it. This is your turf. We're just passing through.
Right. It's this peaceful, mutually beneficial interaction. They could have easily tried to take what they needed, but instead they chose to engage in a more civilized way.
Yeah, it shows a real respect for the other. Okay, but hold on a second. They weren't just wandering around aimlessly for decades, right? I mean, they were on a mission with a specific goal in mind.
Absolutely. And their journey was definitely not a quick one. 40 years in the wilderness, that's a serious commitment.
40 years. I get impatient waiting for a table at a restaurant, let alone a promised land. But I see your point. Maybe sometimes the best things in life do take time.
Exactly. And during those 40 years, Moses constantly reminded them of how God provided for them, even when things looked bleak.
A powerful message about trust and patience. Waiting for the right opportunities. Not forcing things.
Right. Trusting the process.
Okay, so they're being told to respect boundaries, be patient, trust the process. What else happens on this epic road trip?
Well, after years of wandering, they finally run into a major obstacle, Sihon, the king of the Amorites. And this marks a turning point in their journey. It's the beginning of them possessing the Promised Land.
So this is where things get a little less peace, love, and understanding, and a little more, well, conquest.
Yeah, you could say that. It's important to remember that they were instructed to avoid conflict with certain groups, but they were also empowered to fight when necessary.
So sometimes you got to stand up and fight for what you believe in. But how do you know when it's the right time to fight and when it's better to walk away?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's about discernment. Figuring out when to push forward and when to hold back.
All right, so we've got respecting boundaries, trusting the process, and being discerning about when to take action. Pretty heavy stuff for one chapter of the Bible.
Oh, we've only just scratched the surface.
My brain is already getting a workout. But before we move on, I need to get something straight. They were told to avoid conflict because these groups had their own destinies, their own land. But then they go and conquer Sihon and take his land. How does that even make sense?
That's a great question, and it leads us into a deeper conversation about ethical decision-making.
Okay, I am intrigued. Let's unpack that.
Yeah, it's a head-scratcher, right? They're told to avoid conflict, but then they end up taking land. Seems a little contradictory.
Right. When do you turn the other cheek?
Yeah.
And when do you stand up and fight? How do you know?
Well, I think the key is understanding the principles behind the rules, and then applying those principles to each situation thoughtfully.
Okay, so in this case, they were told to avoid those specific groups because those groups had their own destinies.
Right.
But Sihon wasn't part of that protected group, so they were allowed to fight.
Right. It's about recognizing there are different types of conflict and different outcomes and different motivations. It really comes down to discernment.
Okay, that makes sense on a theoretical level.
Yeah.
But how do you apply that to real life? I don't have a burning bush telling me what to do.
Right. But we can still look to the principles in the story for guidance. For example, one of the key principles seems to be pursuing justice. The Israelites were seeking to reclaim land that had been promised to them, land that had been unjustly taken.
So it wasn't just about conquering for the sake of conquering.
Exactly. There's a deeper purpose.
Right. Okay, so that makes sense in this specific case. But what about those times when it's not so black and white? When it's not so clear whether you should speak up or just let it go?
I think that's when things get really tricky, and there's not a one-size-fits-all answer, you know? It requires really careful consideration,
Yeah.
seeking wise counsel, and trusting your own intuition.
Okay. So it's not about always having the answer, but about asking the right questions.
Yes, it's about being thoughtful, prayerful, and being willing to sort of like engage in the messy process of figuring things out.
That's a good takeaway. It's not about having a rule book,
Yeah.
but about developing your own inner compass
Yeah.
and trusting yourself.
Absolutely. And recognizing that even with good intentions, our actions can have unintended consequences. We're
Yeah.
not always going to get it right, but we keep trying.
It's about striving to act with integrity and compassion.
Yes.
This reminds me of something that happened at work a few months ago. There was this decision being made, and I felt like it was really unfair. And I knew I had to say something.
Wow.
Yeah, it wasn't easy.
Right.
But in the end, I felt like I did the right thing.
It takes courage to stand up for what you believe in.
It really does. Okay, so we've talked about respecting boundaries, trusting the process, having the courage to face those challenges, and trying to discern when to engage in conflict, when to seek peace.
Right.
Is there anything else we can learn from this chapter to help us with our own, modern-day wilderness?
Well, one thing to remember is that their journey wasn't just about conquering land. It was about building a nation, a society based on values and principles.
Building a nation.
Yeah.
So it wasn't just about the destination, but about the journey itself.
Exactly. Like
Yeah.
who they became along the way mattered just as much. And I think that's such a powerful metaphor for our own lives, too.
Right. It's not just about checking things off our to-do list, but about, how we live our lives.
Totally. What are the
Wow.
values we're embodying?
What kind of impact are we having on the world? What kind of legacy are we creating?
Exactly. It's about building a life that's meaningful and aligned with our values.
Yeah, because if we're constantly cutting corners or compromising our integrity just to get ahead, what's the point?
Right. It's about the journey and the destination. And I think that's like the real challenge and the ultimate reward of being human.
Yeah, living a life of purpose and integrity, even when it's hard.
Couldn't said it better myself.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground, from respecting boundaries to figuring out when to engage in conflict to practicing gratitude and building a life of meaning. And it all comes from just one chapter of the Bible.
It's pretty amazing, right? These stories have resonated with people for centuries.
They really offer some timeless insights into what it means to be human. Okay, but before we wrap things up, I have one more question. We've been talking about how the Israelites were told to avoid conflict with certain groups because those groups were meant to have their own land.
Right.
So does that mean we should always avoid conflict? What if someone is treating me poorly or taking advantage of me? Do I just sit there and take it?
That's a really tough question. And it's something we all struggle with, I think.
Right? Because it doesn't feel right to just let people walk all over you.
Yeah.
But how do you know when to engage and when to just turn the other cheek?
It's the million-dollar question. And I
Okay.
don't have a simple answer, but I do think it's a question worth wrestling with. It's about trying to figure out what's right, even when it's hard.
Maybe that's the point. Maybe the journey itself is the answer. We keep seeking wisdom, we keep learning, we keep trying to do the best we can, even when it's hard.
I love that. Keep learning, keep growing, and keep trying to do what's right, even when we don't have all the answers.
Maybe that's how we find our way to the promised land, whatever that looks like for each of us.
Beautiful. Well, that's all the time we have for today. But we hope you'll keep exploring these ideas, keep asking those tough questions, and keep striving to live a life that reflects your values. Until next time, happy diving.